Well, speaking of the B word, I speak, of course, of na 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 Batman, one of my favorite superheroes, and crucially, a part of the world, a place in southeast Turkey. We move now on to the story, or rather, a series of connected stories of archaeology under threat from flooding, in some cases natural, and in some cases man instigated or human instigated flooding. And this is actually the story of a site called Hassan Keyf or Kiev or Keef. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. Apologies. That sits on the banks of the Tigris River in Turkey and is a settlement with more or less continuous human occupation for the past 12,000 years. But it is set to be flooded. Let's see. Turkish government has given local residents until the 8th of October to evacuate. Um, Following the construction of a dam, the construction of the dam and the hydroelectric power plant started back in 2006, and it seems that that this archaeological site, along with 198 other settlements in the region, and thousands of human and man-made caves, hundreds of historical and religious sites, and 80,000 people being displaced, is going to be the result of this dam coming into operation. Now, this should also be balanced with the fact that upon its completion, it will be the fourth biggest dam in Turkey, and is predicted to generate 4,200 gigawatt hours of electricity annually. Um, but I suppose to a certain extent, the question is at what cost? The headline for this story in The Guardian quotes someone describing this as barbaric. They are barbaric. Turkey prepares to flood 12,000-year-old city to build dam. What do you think?
This is a really, really interesting story, I think. In people who look at global geopolitics
Mm,
have been saying for many years now that if 20th century wars were fought over oil,
hmm
21st century wars will be fought over water.
Okay. Mm,
That in a time of political instability and climate change, whatever the causes, still argue about, but climate change is a reality,
hmm
and so control of water is which nobody can exist without.
mm,
We can exist for weeks without food. We can only exist for days without water.
mm, mm,
And so, and particularly in an area like the Middle East,
hmm
water and control of water has been historically, certainly in the last 40, 50, 60 years, has been used both as a national virility symbol.
hmm
I'm going back here to the 1960s when, for example, the Nasser regime in Egypt built the Aswan High Dam and famously flooded Abu Simbel, which was, there's that huge project to move the Temple of Ramses at Abu Simbel onto an artificial into an artificial
hmm hmm
landscape to escape the Lake Nasser.
Yeah.
Um, and that was done at a time when Egypt was trying to build itself up as the local power to balance Israel, which was supported by America. Egypt was supported by Russia,
hmm
the Soviet Union.
hmm
And there was global geopolitics being played out there at a regional level, and one of the symbols of that was control of the Nile. Um, Here you've got the in this case the Tigris, the River Tigris,
mm,
of course, famous Tigris and the Euphrates, the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, and so on.
mm,
This is southeast Turkey. It borders on Iraq and Kurdistan.
hmm
Um, Obviously, Turkey needs power, but also the Turkish government, the central Turkish government in Ankara, led by a a strongman leader, um, is it's asserting its control over the environment as well as the you know
Yeah.
as well as politically, I think.
Well, and it
um
should be said though that local residents. This isn't just the Guardian commenting on this. Local
mm,
residents. It's easy, I think, sometimes to look at governments with determined leadership, shall we say, and I think that there's
Mm,
no voice of opposition. But Ridvan Ihan, who was born in one of the caves at Hassan Kef, or Kif,
mm,
is an active member of an initiative to keep the site and indeed the place where he was born alive. Um, Founded in 2006 as a grassroots campaign to halt the dam project. In the
mm,
article here, it says that I'll quote here, walking along the mountainside facing the town, Ihan reached a cave clearly marked with an engraved cross indicating an ancient church. It's not just our story, Hassan Kayef. It's also your story because it's the human story, he said. It's about. It is unknown what year the church dates back to, he said. Only 10% of the
mm.
area has been actually explored by archaeologists. We've
Yes.
asked for the area to be an open air museum, but the government won't accept it. If you dig here, you will find cultures layered one atop the other. And and the thing is, Turkey is not. This isn't the only place on the Anatolian Peninsula, I should say, where you find
Mm.
these sorts of palimpsests, these tell-like sites. And so,
Oh,
and so,
absolutely.
so it's not. I should be careful here. It's not unique as an example of continuous human occupation. But I
No,
suppose
and indeed we
the
should say,
issue here,
famously the site, sites like Catalhoyuk and
yeah,
in Turkey is one of
exactly.
the earliest um, developed settlements that's
Yeah,
currently under being investigated, isn't it?
it's often described as one of the first towns, I suppose, in the world.
Yes. Yeah.
And in this instance, I guess the issue is we don't know what we're losing if less than 10% has been
Yeah.
actually examined.
Precisely.
Of course, we've linked this to a story coming out of Spain, where a site of some antiquity, 7,000-year-old dolmen de Guadalperal, a megalithic monument made of up to 144 standing stones, has recently been emerging or re-emerging from uh, actually, from a similar sort of idea in some respects. So we have a site that was discovered in the 1920s that became part of a reservoir in the 1960s, and now
Mm.
because of a warming trend, water is receding and revealing the monument. But that may not last. The water may well come back when the reservoir fills up again. And so this was brought to my attention in the context of whether or not this site, like Abu Simbel, should be moved and what that means. Now, interestingly, uh, the person who brought this to my attention as an issue was suggesting from an Australian perspective that moving the monument would divorce it from its meaning and its purpose and its sort of spiritual significance. And we managed to sort of have an interesting mental exercise unfold where the question was whether or not it was possible to have the best of both worlds and whether actually the original monument builders would rather this stayed in place. It's unlikely that they wanted it to be flooded when it was built
Mm.
7,000 years ago, but would they much rather that it was anchored to the spot or that people got to visit it at another dry location? And it's interesting because if you think about people who visit Abu Simbel today, for example, most of them, I imagine, don't think about the fact that the whole thing has been moved. They get to have their interaction with the architecture, with the art, the selfie, all this sort of thing, the holiday snap, um, and then they move on.
Mm.
And arguably, that is a valid interaction with that monument. And I wonder whether, in cases like, for example, this one in Spain, or for example, even in Turkey, moving something out of the way of water that's either going to come back or that's going to be introduced into the landscape is is a valid expression of the original, a facsimile, I suppose you could say, even if it's made of the same material. It's a curious one.
Yeah. I would start by saying we can't ever know what the original builders would have thought.
No. Hmm.
We don't know what their philosophical landscape was when it comes to, and their decision making landscape was when it
Mm.
comes to things like this.
Hmm.
So, um, we start from a point maybe of wanting to respect the past, respect the artifact, respect their achievement.
Hmm.
Um, Personal feelings then come into it, and I would say that unless you have an absolutely exceptional building, exceptional site, um, and you can argue that Abu Simbel was that,
Hmm.
although other temples like Philae weren't moved,
Yes.
and there have been ongoing arguments about whether it should be,
Yeah. Yeah.
which arguably is equally architecturally significant as Abu Simbel was.
Hmm.
Um, then, if you take the historical landscape as a continuum,
Hmm.
then an object in that continuum should take whatever is thrown at it.
And of course, we're saying this sitting in a great big glass house, having had a certain Lord Elgin take take objects from Greece, ostensibly to save them from being shot at by army
And
people who were
arguably,
practicing in the army, pot shots.
and arguably legally, although people contest that.
Yeah,
And
it's
he didn't take all of them. He took about half.
yeah, hmm,
So these things are complex,
yeah,
and I don't think there are any right. I mean, in this case, you could argue, for example, that the site has it was. I say discovered in the 19. We said discovered in the 1920s. It was recognised by archaeologists in the 1920s.
yeah,
Obviously, it was known well before that locally, I would imagine.
hmm,
But it entered the archaeological mind space in the 1920s.
hmm,
It's flooded in the 1960s. It then re-emerges, apparently intact. The stones appear to be still upright and so on in 2019.
hmm,
Um, so a cycle has taken place, a cycle of knowledge, but also a cycle of physical change.
hmm,
And it's still there, and it can be commented on again as we're doing now. And whether or not it gets flooded again, if the reservoir, the level in the reservoir rises, we've also got now a site that's emblematic, maybe of climate change and the need to, for water in certain parts of Spain,
hmm,
as we were
hmm,
talking about in what we didn't talk about in terms of the Turkish dam, for example, is the effect on which isn't touched on in that article, which is looking at the historical issues of the lake created behind a hydro dam like that one.
hmm,
What happens further downstream if the water is interrupted or the flow is less?
hmm,
Does it affect the flooding patterns, which affect agriculture, but also affect the preservation of archaeology? We've seen in the fens have been drying out. They've been drained and dried out over the last 30, 40 years in particular.
hmm,
And people like Francis Pryor talk about the damage that's doing to archaeology we don't even know is there because it's drying out and being destroyed,
hmm.
or at least being changed from the anoxic environment it might have been in if the ground was permanently flooded, but permanently wet,
And
to
and is that
you know
is that therefore a sensible a sensible rule of thumb is that it's impossible to account for all
mm,
unknowns in that sense.
yeah.
What we know is that drying out the fens reclaims land and has been good historically for farming purposes.
Mm,
We don't know and can't quantify the damage done to archaeology.
mm,
Uh, that is a reasonable balance, I suppose, to have. It's a shame, possibly, but we can't confirm that. In this instance, I suppose you have certainly the in the Turkish case, you have a known loss, but also a quantifiable loss,
mm,
in so much as it's a known unknown.
yeah.
We know that only a certain amount of that site has been investigated. In the Spanish case, it's a much more uh, fully understood loss, but it seems to be a cyclical cycle, or a cyclical cycle, obviously, a cyclical relationship with the
Mm,
environment. And so, arguably, this could. There's nothing stopping archaeologists from investigating this when it's dry, and maybe even monitoring how it changes over time because of its relationship with the water.
Yeah, there's another microcosm of this, isn't there? That in the row about Stonehenge and Salisbury Plain that's going on at the moment, where you've
Mm,
got the site at Blickmead, where there's an argument that the creating this artificial thing, the A303 upgrade,
mm,
is going to interrupt the drainage patterns and lead to a very well preserved Mesolithic site drying out and being damaged
mhm,
irrevocably. And there's also the argument about the old A303 and the old roads in the landscape themselves, and whether they should be retained as part of the history of the landscape or removed to regrass and rewild the landscape. But that will never get us back to the Neolithic landscape because we're living in the 20 teens and not 3000 BC.
mm,
So anything we ever do, in that respect, is uh, is sort of tokenistic of its approach like that, and it shouldn't be. The past is the past. It happened. All we're trying to do is preserve the best of it for the future while trying to understand it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I suppose what we're saying is stuff happens. Are
I
they,
think I'm, yeah, I think I'd be really sort of reductionist about it, as stuff happens, and much as we'd like to, archaeologists can't do everything, and
hmm.
inevitably there are going to be arguments when things get left out.
Mm, okay, okay. Well, I suppose actually there's also there's a small little add-on here in so much as the instinct of archaeologists and those who love history and those, for example, who will be self-selecting in terms of turning up on the Archaeology Facebook page
Mm.
is to examine and preserve as much as possible
Yeah,
because
yeah.
you never know what might be important, and also everything to a certain extent is interesting. Even a piece of Roman roof tile, even though there's tons of it that you can recover in the UK, to someone who's never seen it before, that is fascinating, and therefore the instinct is to keep hold of it all. But there is this, in a very real sense, this tension between our interests and broader society. That's sort of the needs of the many versus the needs of the few, sort of Vulcan, Mr. Spock thing. But also, actually, as you say, this is in many ways uh, a coal face at which archaeologists
Mm.
need to understand and accept that time and change is inevitable.
Hard choices.
Yeah, yeah. So it's an interesting example, and so I'm glad that we discussed this. But inevitably, there's no one answer at all.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
But the other thing is, remember, archaeology is very much grounded in the real world and the real world of economics and politics. And I
Mm,
think we have to remember, as I say, that connection between politics, power, and water in the Middle East is a really underrated one, and one that is important and will become increasingly so,
yeah. Yeah.
in all probability.
Yeah. Okay.